Alright, hello everybody. We're coming in today for the second video of what I'm calling President's Month. Although technically we're just continuing with the President's series, so as I promised, I wanted to kind of just move through a couple more of these, at least get up to Lincoln by March. That's the goal here. So we are going on today to President number 10. Last week we covered William Henry Harrison as President number 9. And as we mentioned, first president to die in office, there's really not a whole lot with him to talk about his career in office because he was only in office for a month. He didn't have time to do anything. However, the 10th president is also tied to Harrison because he's also significant because this marks the first time that not only has a president died in office, but a vice president has had to ascend to the office of the presidency through the death of the president. So this causes in itself some confusion when this happens, and this president unfortunately has to kind of be that maverick that has to set forward what the exact role is of the vice president when the president dies. So today we are going ahead and we are moving forward with the 10th president of the United States. We're finally out of the single digits. But we are moving forward to the 10th president, who is none other than probably someone that is not very well known. His name, President John Tyler. This is his presidential portrait, little profile thing. Now, as always, let's go ahead and we'll just jump right into it here. So, starting with the going up through the biography, going up through the earlier careers, up to the presidency. Now, thank goodness, I can tell you this, Tyler actually has some info on his presidency compared to Harrison, because unlike Harrison, who died in office, Tyler actually completes Harrison's term. So let's go ahead and start out here. First thing, John Tyler is born on March 29th in 1790 to his family at the family plantation of Greenway, which is located in Charles City County, Virginia. His father, John Tyler Sr., was a wealthy planter and politician in Virginia during that time. Keep in mind, I should have added this on the last video, but William Henry Harrison was also the last U.S. president to have been born a British subject. He was the last president born before we declared independence. So every president after this, starting with Tyler, has been born an American citizen. So yes, it took us until president number 10 to stop having presidents that have been born British citizens. It took us until the 1840s. Tyler, during his upbringing at home, he very much was brought up in the old Southern style of basically agriculture and plantation farm work. His family was one of the wealthy elite families in Virginia. He basically was privileged. He didn't really have to do a whole lot of the work, but he also had a defined... The thing that his Southern upbringing gets for him is as he grows up and he starts to get his political mindset in gear, as we all know, a leading issue supposedly in the South. Well, it was an issue. It just not exactly for a certain reason, but I don't think we want to go on that. But anyway, leading up to the Civil War, one of the main issues in the South was the arguments for states' rights, that unless it was specifically listed in the Constitution, states shouldn't have the power and the federal government's authority should be limited. Now, unfortunately, that also led to the Civil War because today they'll say, oh, it was over states' rights. Yeah, the states' rights to defy the federal government to own slaves when it said slaves were not going to be owned anymore. So, again, slavery, but you go ahead and believe what you're going to believe. But anyway, states' rights in general, yes, was an issue. Just, it wasn't, when the Civil War broke out, it wasn't just states' rights. It was not primarily that. There was another driving factor. But anyway, this kind of imprints on John during his upbringing. His dad, of course, his family kind of imprints it on him and just the Southern culture in general, so that when he starts his political career, I think you can guess, John Tyler is going to be a very big advocate for states' rights. And unfortunately, this is going to lead to a smear on his life after he retired, which we'll get to at the end. Anyway, Tyler ends up going to college at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, where he ends up graduating in 1807. After graduating from college, he attended many different little private tutors. He kind of learned from them in order to practice law. So after he graduates college in 1807 and goes through multiple private tutors that I don't think he found himself. I think it was more his dad kind of found them for him, and eventually he went ahead and attended all these in order to learn how to practice law. So pretty much straight from the outset, Tyler knows he wants to go into a political law. He wants to go to a political career. And this starts fairly early compared to other presidents who meagerly sometimes found their way into it. In 1811, keep in mind, Tyler was born in 1790, so this would place him at, what I'm trying to think here, 21 years old. At the age of 21 years old, Tyler ends up being elected to the Virginia state legislature, and this begins his political career that will dominate most of his life. He ends up marrying Letitia Christian in 1813, and they end up having 8 children. Now, Tyler, as a fun fact, I will just say it now. He ends up later having a total of 15 children, making him the father of the most children of any president. He had more children than any president in U.S. history. Although he doesn't all have it with the same wife, but we'll get to that later. So he had 8 with Letitia. That was his first wife. Tyler ends up serving as a representative from Virginia in the United States House of Representatives after he runs in 1815 and he gets elected. So between 1816 and 1821, he ends up serving in the U.S. House. While in the U.S. House, he starts really putting forward his political views. He votes against almost any national legislation that comes through, and he also votes against the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which that was, if you recall, that period in American history where Missouri wanted to be admitted as a state. Well, Missouri had slaves. It would offset the power balance between the free and slave states, so a compromise was made that in return for Missouri becoming a slave state, being admitted as a slave state, the northern section of Massachusetts would be admitted as the free state of Maine, and that slavery in the future, no slave states would be made or allowed north of Missouri's southern border, except for ones that had already been created. So in that exception, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, these states were all safe because they already had existed, but any new states that would allow slavery could not be north of that southern border. Now, Tyler opposed this because, of course, he'd been brought up in the South. He had been brought up with a owning family. He very much did not like the use of the federal government trying to interfere in the affairs of private life. He very much seen that slavery was a public and domestic affair, and the government should have no place in regulating it. So he of course, he was not in favor of the compromise and voted against it. And just as a recap, while he's there, Tyler very much believes the Constitution was to be strictly interpreted and that no additional power should be given to the federal government. Whatever the Constitution says is what it says. If it does not say it, you can't do it. Very strict. Basically, if the Constitution says it, do it. If it does not say it, don't try to say, well, it hints that we could do this, or it doesn't really say this specifically, but it implies. Tyler's view would be, no, there is no imply. It's either it says you can do that or you can't do it. And of course, he favors states' rights, which puts him into the Democratic-Republican affiliation during the early part of his career, the earlier party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and the preceder to the Democrats. Now, Tyler ends up returning to the Virginia legislature after 1821. He leaves the U.S. House of Representatives. He returns to the Virginia legislature and serves there for a number of years until 1825, when he gets elected as Virginia governor. And he is the governor of Virginia until 1827. While during his time as governor, he also delivers the eulogy for Thomas Jefferson, who died on July 4th of 1826. So when Jefferson dies, the governor of Virginia is supposed to give the eulogy because it was A, a founding father, and B, a president. Well, Tyler just happens to be the governor at the time, so he ends up giving the eulogy at Jefferson's funeral. Tyler once again leaves Virginia, at least his home state's politics, in 1827, as he gets elected to the U.S. Senate as a senator from Virginia between 1826 well, 1827 is when he goes and takes office, and then he eventually serves as a senator from Virginia until through 1836. Now, during his time in the Senate, Andrew Jackson has come into power. Jacksonian democracy is coming about. And Tyler is very much, he grows disillusioned with Jackson's policies. He grows very disillusioned with his behaviors. And he grows disillusioned with his movement overall, of his followers. Eventually, Tyler comes to the conclusion that he despises Jackson, that he hates the man, he hates anyone that supports Jackson, and he will do anything that he can to impede or prevent him from passing legislation. Or not passing legislation, but basically obstructing his presidency, which he's able to do because during Jackson's time in office, the Senate ends up censoring him after he basically refused several attempts to refinance the national bank, which, of course, opponents to Jackson were for, and those that were with Jackson very much did not want the bank. And after Jackson does this, the U.S. Senate officially censors him, symbolically basically saying, we disapprove of you. It really had no effect. And Tyler was very much part of this censor. He was one of the senators that voted to censor Jackson during his time in office. In 1836, Tyler, I'm so sorry for the mess ups. Tyler ends up resigning his Senate seat, not due to being ousted in an election, but because Virginia is basically, apparently by this point, a majority of Virginians have grown to love Jackson. And they don't like the idea that one of their own senators voted to censor him. And the Virginia state government basically sends to Tyler the message that you need to retract your censor vote. Well, Tyler has no intention of retracting a censure vote because it's what he felt. It's what he feels about Jackson. And he's like, I already voted that way. I'm not going to retract it just because you want me to. Because honestly, I think the man is a butt. I think the man is crap, to put it more mildly. But anyway, because of his disagreement with the state government, Tyler, instead of simply retracting his censure vote, he resigns his seat and says, "Okay, I'm not going to retract the vote. You obviously don't. We were obviously not going to come to an agreement. So guess what? I quit." He resigns his seat in order to avoid retracting his censure. That way, he could still symbolically have sent a message to Jackson. And before we go along here, got a little photo that I can think of. I'm going to try to do these a little closer in. We have a little photograph of the birthplace of John Tyler, his family home of Greenway, and the Greenway Plantation, main house, where he was born in 1790, which is still a nationally registered historical site today in Virginia. You can actually go see it and tour it. Moving the notebook here, our notes. Now, due to his anti-Jackson views and anti-Democrat views, as Jackson supporters become known, they become known as the Democrats, the founders of the Democratic Party of today, but of course their ideology was a lot different back then. But Tyler becomes affiliated with the opposition to the Democrats and Jackson's policies, and this eventually molds into a new party called the Whigs, which, as we may recall, we mentioned in the last video because William Henry Harrison was a Whig. And the Whigs are very much full of people from the South, and they're full of people from the West, although when we say the West today, we're probably thinking, oh, that's California, Oregon, Washington. No. Back then, we didn't have those territories. So back then, the West was what we would today call the Midwest. So like my home state of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, these areas that we would call the Midwest today, back then, that was the West. So this is where a bulk of the Whig support comes from. And Tyler becomes affiliated with the New Whig Party, partly and mostly because of his anti-Jacksonian views. So in 1840, the Whigs choose Tyler due to his prominence in both Virginia state politics and on the national level. They choose him to be William Henry Harrison's running mate on the presidential ticket that year. Tyler is nominated to be Harrison's vice presidential candidate. Partly, in part, because Harrison is from Ohio. Harrison attracts most of the votes from the West. They need someone on that ticket to attract those voters in the South who are so ardent about states' rights. Tyler is the perfect man. He's a states' rights supporter. He's from Virginia. He very much would bring in that Southern aspect. So the Whigs don't really appoint Tyler due to their likability of him, but simply to attract voters. And they know that, okay, this guy's from the South. He's got the same views of most Southerners. So if we put him on the ticket with Harrison, it will balance the ticket out, and we'll pull in votes from both the West and the South that might allow us to overtake incumbent President Democrat Martin Van Buren in 1840. So this is why Tyler is put on there. Not because he's well liked by the Whigs, simply because he's a political advantage in an election. Well, this comes back to haunt the Whigs, because in honesty, Tyler did not get along with a majority of the Whig leadership, notably Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. And this causes conflict upon Harrison's death, because they had merely appointed him on there to attract for political purposes, not for the purpose of thinking, oh, he might become president. And then we got to deal with a person we hate. And that has happened in so many cases of American history where presidents would die and a vice president would succeed to office. Another famous one would be, for example, Theodore Roosevelt. Many of President William McKinley's advisors during his time, when he appointed Theodore Roosevelt as his vice president after his first vice president, I think, died, he had basically gotten many Republicans who had kind of come up to him and said, why would you appoint this rough, just eccentric, outside Western man to our party when he is so not into the norms of elegance in society? He's very much a frontier man. He's a hunter. He's this outdoorsman that's just odd. He's not even focused with politics. And they basically blasted McKinley at the time, and eventually one of them ironically said the very sentence that, do you realize there is only one bullet between you and that cowboy? And ironically enough, McKinley ended up getting shot and died from gangrene that set in the wound, and guess who becomes president upon McKinley's death? And of course, now we admire Theodore Roosevelt today, but at the time, he was hated by his own party, by the Republicans, because he had progressive values that were not quite with the Republicans yet. But that was another instance that we will talk about in the future of a vice president ascending to the office of the presidency, when in reality, he was not even real well liked by the party. And this was the case with Tyler. Now, Harrison wins, as we all know, the election of 1840. He beats Van Buren on the campaign slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Well, the intention is that Tyler's going to be vice president, so guess who takes office as vice president when Harrison takes office as president? John Tyler. Harrison, however, is heavily influenced. Unlike Tyler, who very much does not get along with Clay and Webster, Harrison is somewhat influenced by these two men. So that's part of the reason why I think they liked Harrison so much, was because they knew they could exert a certain amount of influence over him and kind of guide his influence, his decisions. Where Tyler, he didn't even like them from the start, so there was no way they were going to influence him. Unfortunately, these two men's worst nightmare come true when on April 4th, Harrison dies, April 4th, 1841, leaving Tyler the first vice president in history who now has to assume the office of president upon the death of the president. And he gets word. Tyler is actually not in Washington, D.C. when Harrison dies. He is at home in Virginia, and although he had been kind of kept in check, he had been kept in the know-how of Harrison's condition, he'd been kind of kept informed. He had chosen not to return to Washington, D.C. because he felt that if he had returned to Washington, D.C., it would have seen that he was a little too eager or something, and that he was just waiting for Harrison to die in order to assume power. He didn't want to seem like that. And that's not what his intent was anyway, but he was afraid that he was going to come off like that. So he had stayed at home at his own plantation in Virginia. When Harrison died, they had to send one of the cabinet members' nephews to, I think it was Webster's nephew, actually got sent to the plantation about a day later and basically delivered the little letter or whatever it was. It was a little piece of paper that informed him that Harrison, the president, has died. You need to return to the capital immediately. Tyler arrived back on April 6th, where he takes the oath of office on April 6th of 1841. However, he has a problem upon assuming the office of president. technically, yes, that we now know without a shadow of a doubt that when the president dies, the vice president automatically becomes the president. But back then, this was the first time that it ever happened, and the Constitution at the time was not explicitly clear over who's going to succeed the president when he dies. The Constitution was not clear at that point. Now, today, we are clear because we have the 25th Amendment that specifically states that the vice president becomes president upon the death of the president. But keep in mind, the 25th Amendment was not ratified until 1951. It wasn't even thought of until after World War II. And this is the 1840s. So the original Constitution was quite vague on who should succeed the president, and, well, not really who should succeed. I should say this. The Constitution did say the vice president would succeed the president, but it was vague on whether or not were they a full-on president, did they have all the powers and salary of the president, or were they just like kind of a placement holder, were they an acting president until a new one could be elected? It was really vague on that prospect. Now, Tyler insisted that he was the rightful president. He insisted that upon the death of Harrison, he was now president with all the powers of the presidency and with the salary that came with the presidency. He insisted that he was a full-on actual president. Clay and Webster, who were very much kind of against Tyler, especially Clay, kind of didn't like the idea now that the one man they hated and had merely put on there for political reasons was now president, and of course they did anything they could to try to backtrack Tyler's authority. So many of Clay himself, and many of his fellow Whigs and other supporters, and even political opponents like the Democrats, don't refer to Tyler as the president. They refer to him as his excellency. He's not a president. He's not a he's not a full-on president. Tyler, and some of them even referred to him when they addressed him in mail, they would address it as acting President Tyler. They would not address him as president. Tyler hated this. And at any point, and this is very well documented, that if he would receive a letter or any sort of mail that addressed him as acting president, he would refuse to open it and send it back to the sender. So Tyler was very insistent that I am not an acting president. I'm a full-on president. Now, eventually, Tyler kind of wins that battle. After a year or two, they kind of give up on that tactic, and it just is accepted that Tyler is president, whether we like it or not. Now, the part of the reason that Tyler has such a problem with the Whig leadership is that he holds mostly contradicting views with a majority of the Whig Party, which he's affiliated with. He holds contradicting views. The only reason he really joined it was because they shared a common interest in opposing Democrats in Jackson. Tyler initially, upon inheriting the presidency from Harrison, he keeps Harrison's cabinet initially because he doesn't want to really anger the Whigs any further. He's like, okay, as a sign of goodwill, I'll keep Harrison's cabinet. I won't take another one. However, after he vetoes several bills for a new national bank, which was a key aim of the Whigs, they wanted to put a new national bank, which there hadn't been one since Andrew Jackson because he had let the old bank just kind of go without funding and then die out. They wanted to create another one. They thought, okay, Tyler's a Whig, we'll have it. We got it in the bag. Tyler vetoes the Whig bills, stopping it dead in the tracks. No new national bank is ever created again in U.S. history. And because of Tyler's decision, every cabinet member except for Webster resigns. Webster stays on because he eventually kind of becomes a little more friendly with Tyler. He comes to not be so much of an adversary and tries to work with him. But every other cabinet member that he had inherited from Harrison, upon vetoing those bills, resigns. It creates that action alone creates such an animosity between him and the Whigs that it leads to an attempt in 1843 for the Whigs to bring impeachment charges against Tyler, which he was never actually impeached, so he's not the first president to be impeached, but he was the first president that ever had impeachment proceedings begun against him. Basically, the search to see if they could officially charge him with anything. In 1842, we come back to Tyler's personal life. Letitia dies of a stroke. Now, in 1839, she had had a stroke in 1839, and this had actually paralyzed her on her, I believe it was her left side. And she continued to live, although she was kind of handicapped afterward. In 1842, Letitia has a second stroke, and she's not so lucky this time. She passes away at the age of 51. She marks the first lady to pass away in the White House. In 1844, Tyler ends up remarrying as he marries Julia Gardner, who is 30 years younger than him. Keep in mind, you want to know how this is a little strange. Tyler, by this time, is 54 years old. Julia is only 24, and they get married. They end up having 7 children on top of Tyler's 8 that he had already had with Letitia, which totals that Tyler now has the most children of any president, as we mentioned earlier. He has a total of 15 children from both marriages. Now, aside from his political conflict with the Whig Party and the Whig Party elite, Tyler does get some achievements done during his presidency. He's not a complete wipeout. In 1841, upon assuming the presidency, he signs the Preemption Act, which helps to start kind of driving Western settlement in the Western territories by allowing people to claim 160 acres of land and then purchase that land from the government. He also helps bring an end to the war with the Seminole Indians in Florida. Not that they really pushed the Seminole Indians out of Florida, but more it's become a waste of time by this point because any Seminole that are still in Florida are now hiding in the Everglades, and the U.S. Army is having difficulty even finding them there, let alone fighting them. So Tyler basically concludes, you know what, let the Seminole be. Let's just end this conflict. So he ends the Seminole War in Florida. During his tenure in office, his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, his former kind of rival, signs the Webster-Ashburton Treaty with Great Britain, which fixes the border with northern Maine and British Canada, which gives Maine its modern northern border that it has with Canada. Because up to that point, that northern border was somewhat disputed over who owned what. And then, he also, during his presidency in 1844, the Treaty of, I'm trying to say this right, Wanghia, gave Americans access to Chinese trading ports in Asia. So basically, the U.S. now has open trade up with China during Tyler's presidency, which of course gives it access to a whole new lucrative trade market that's highly sought after in Europe and almost anywhere outside of Asia. Just before, and really starts the U.S. with trading big time in China, which we'll see evolve over the course of the 19th century. Now, just before leaving office, Tyler also signs 2 other bills regarding states. He signs a bill that annexes the Republic of Texas, which the Republic of Texas had kind of been requesting the United States annex it for some time, but the previous presidents, both Harrison didn't even have the time, but he had been opposed to it, and Van Buren had been opposed to it. And basically what happens is, although Texas was wanting annexation, the presidents weren't really in favor of annexing Texas because they feared angering Mexico. Tyler, who was himself a Southerner, and Texas was far south of the Missouri line and already had slaves, it would be a big old slave state and gain for his home region. He's all for Texas annexation. So just before he leaves office in March of 1845, he goes ahead and signs the bill that officially annexes Texas as the 28th state of the United States. And then on the day before he leaves office, his last full day of office, he also signs the bill that admits Florida as a U.S. state. So if you're down there in Orlando or Miami, you can thank John Tyler for you being a state. You can thank this man. Now, when 1844 comes, initially, Tyler tried to organize a campaign. He thought that he wanted to do a second term. He was very much certain he wanted to do a second term. The problem was by this point, Tyler had kind of been disowned by the Whig Party. The Whig Party really didn't even count him as affiliated with them anymore, and they kind of had no intention of renominating him on their platform. So if Tyler was going to run for a second term, he was going to have to run on his own as a third-party candidate, which of course has never really gone well except for one instance in American history, and this was not that instance. But anyway, Tyler, because of his basically disownment by the Whigs, he becomes this political outsider, and he quickly realizes he really does not have a shot at winning the election, so he basically pulls out of the election before the end, before 1844's election day is held, because he realized he really does not have a shot at the presidency. So in March 1845, Tyler leaves office. He leaves the office of the presidency. He's done. And he returns home to his plantation of Sherwood Forest on the James River between Williamsburg and Richmond, Virginia. And Tyler kind of stays in retirement for some time. He really doesn't get back in politics directly. He kind of stays in retirement for a period of about 15 years. Until about 1861, which, if you have any idea of American history, you know what starts that year: the American Civil War. Now, keep in mind, Tyler is a slaveholder. He basically is a big states' rights advocate. Which way do you think he's going to lean? I know which way he's going to lean. He's going to lean toward the South, and that's exactly what Tyler does. When 1861 comes about, he comes back to the limelight because although he is a Southerner, although he's a states' rights supporter, he initially wants to see if the Union can be saved. He's not in total favor of demolishing it. So he becomes head of a peace conference that seeks to try to mend the wounds between the North and South before it gets too far out of hand. Unfortunately, as we all know, any attempted peace conferences between the two sides before the outbreak of war failed. After this, Tyler becomes convinced that the North, because at the conference, he becomes convinced that the conference's aims were too northern based and that the North was kind of running the show. And he comes to the conclusion after the conference fails that the North will not concede and that our only option is secession from the Union, which is kind of striking given that he was a U.S. president, but yet he was advocating his home state needs to break away from the Union. He advocated for Virginia's secession, which eventually did happen in April of 1861. And Tyler was at the secession convention. He actually voted in favor of Virginia's secession, which passed. Tyler was subsequently elected to serve in the Confederate Congress, but he died in Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, just days before it would convene on January 18th of 1862. Now, unlike most cases, when a president dies, it's officially acknowledged by the current president or by the government in general. They usually make some kind of announcement, and they'll have a state funeral for that president. Tyler is an exception. He didn't get one, and at least not here, because he was seen as a traitor by the North, and Abraham Lincoln, who was president at the time, did not really have any. He heard of Tyler's death, but for the same reason that most of the North did, he correctly deduced, okay, he's seen as a traitor by a wide part of the population. He obviously didn't want to be with us, so why would we throw him a funeral? But Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, very much sees the political grandeur that this could give the South, and he holds a big old Southern state funeral for Tyler upon his death in 1862. And he ends up being buried in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, with a Confederate flag over his casket. He is the only president in U.S. history not to be buried with an American flag over his coffin. And ironically, the very cemetery where he ends up getting buried is also where earlier President James Monroe was buried, and it ends up in the decades later, Jefferson Davis himself ends up being buried in that cemetery too. So if you ever go to Richmond, Virginia, stop by Hollywood Cemetery because you can see the graves of two U.S. presidents and a Confederate president. Any other photos here that we have or diagrams here? Again, just the electoral map of the 1840 election campaign. This is technically Harrison, but because Tyler inherited it from Harrison, it's the same map. So just a review. We showed that in the last video, but that's just a review of which states Harrison and Tyler won compared to Van Buren. And I should point out that, as we mentioned, where the border of Maine got fixed, right here's what I'm meaning. See how this part of Maine is kind of gray? That's because that was disputed with Great Britain over who owned that. That got fixed during Tyler's inherited administration. Here we have a map of the U.S. of basically what it looked like about 1845 during Tyler's presidency. So what we have here, all the pink parts are states. By then, Maine is fixed with that treaty. Russia still owns Alaska. This California and all this belongs to Mexico. This is Mexican territory. This is ours. Florida eventually becomes a state by the end. That's why it really doesn't show it. Florida eventually does become a state, and then the Republic of Texas is admitted as a state. So that just kind of gives you a context of where the nation is at by 1845. Portrait of Tyler in his later years, an actual daguerreotype photograph. And finally, an image of the obelisk that is at his gravesite in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. So that basically, I think, concludes John Tyler. So that will conclude this video. Our next one, as we roll on through here, will be on President James Polk, who for some reason, although he only had a single term in office, he's one of my favorite presidents to just learn about and just talk about. I don't know why. I just like the name. But that basically concludes on John Tyler. So John Tyler has set a precedent. He establishes that the vice president assumes the full powers of the presidency during his inherited term. Although he was very unpopular with his own party, he does establish that very important precedent that has been followed ever since. And had it not been for Harrison's death, Tyler probably wouldn't even really be remembered because he just would have been as insignificant as almost most vice presidents have been. Only a couple have ever stood out. A lot of them have kind of been, they faded away. But that concludes this video. So as always, like, subscribe, comments, questions in the section below. Any suggestions, as always want to take suggestions, although we'll get to that when the February is at least over, which technically is a short month anyway, so we'll see. But that basically concludes for this one. So we will be getting to James Polk either this weekend or the beginning of next week. So until that happens, may everyone continue to stay safe, not get snowed in, not get corona, whatever it may be. Stay safe, and may God bless you all.